What did Leo XIV say that outraged even the most faithful? It began not with thunder nor with trumpets, but with an unsettling calm that seemed to stretch across St. Peter's Square like a veil. The date was marked, the world was watching, and the white smoke had risen, an age-old signal that echoed beyond Vatican walls. A new pope had been chosen, but as the crowd surged and the camera lights blinked to life, there was no jubilant hymn or declaration of victory. There was only silence. Pope Leo XIV, born Robert Francis Prevost, stood in the shadows of the Sistine Chapel balcony, not with the swagger of a newly crowned leader, but with the stillness of a man who had already borne too much. His was not a familiar name. He had not been groomed by Rome, nor prophesied by global media outlets. Instead, he had lived on the margins in forgotten missions, in remote hospitals, in the silence of those who serve with no spotlight. Yet here he was, ready to address the world, not with blessing, but with something far more dangerous, the truth. What followed would come to be known not as a speech, nor even a sermon, but as a moment, a rupture in the papal legacy, a tremor that reached believers and skeptics alike. Within seconds, Pope Leo XIV broke centuries of tradition by pausing. He raised his hand not in benediction, but in quiet, and when he finally spoke, his words were not in Latin, but in plain English. "I know what you expect," he began, "but I am not here to fulfill expectations." The air itself seemed to shift. For the first time in generations, a pope stood before the world not as a continuation of legacy, but as a man stepping deliberately into the unknown. This was not humility. It was a confrontation with the Church's own silence. "Before I bless," he continued, "I must confess." With that, the entire tone of the evening changed. The crowd, the clergy, the cameras, everyone leaned in, not for ceremony, but for revelation. If you're ready to hear what even the most faithful were not prepared to accept, hit the like button, subscribe now, and stay until the very end, because what Leo said next would alter everything. This video will take you on a journey few dare to imagine. Through hidden archives, eyewitness reactions, and the tremors that followed in dioceses across the globe, we will uncover what Pope Leo XIV revealed that night, and why it sparked shockwaves from the pews of New York to the slums of Manila. You'll hear the voices that trembled, the tears that were shed, and the fury that erupted even among the devout. We invite you not only to listen, but to reflect. Could one man's truth unravel centuries of silence? Could a single voice shift the way of a church? And perhaps most daringly, was this confession of betrayal or the first step toward healing? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story belongs not just to church, but to all of us who have ever asked what lies behind the vestments. Long before the white smoke curled into the Roman sky, the Vatican was already trembling, not in fear of external threat, but from the quiet tension brewing within its own corridors. Deep in the heart of the Curia, murmurs had grown into full-fledged unease. Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost was not supposed to make it to the final ballot. His name had appeared like a ghost, unexpected, unendorsed, and unwelcome by many of the old guard. In private conversations cloaked by ritual and Latin litanies, cardinals whispered about his past in Peru, his years among the poor, his refusal to play political games. His file was thin not because he had done little, but because he had never sought notice. There were no grand gestures, no public crusades, only stories told by forgotten bishops, silent nuns, and lay people who remembered the man who knelt beside them instead of above them. That's what unsettled them. He was not a politician in robes. He was a priest in skin and bone. Inside the Sistine Chapel, as ballots were cast and recast, his name refused to fade. It rose again and again, pushed not by alliances but by something more dangerous, belief. Some saw in him a return to the roots of the church, to a gospel not dressed in marble but written on callous hands. Others feared exactly that. "He is too honest," murmured one cardinal from Italy. "He will not protect the church." But Leo, or Robert, as many still called him, had long stopped trying to protect institutions. His mission had been people. He once spent 3 nights sleeping on the floor of a condemned clinic beside a dying migrant woman, her only family gone, her last rites whispered in Quechua. He had stood outside courtrooms where the church was being sued, not to defend it, but to comfort the plaintiffs. And now, That same man stood at the edge of power, summoned not by ambition, but by something far less controllable, the desire for redemption. Not his own, but the Church's. The resistance was immediate. Some within the Vatican began leaking stories to friendly media. Anonymous sources described Leo as naive, divisive, even dangerously sympathetic to reformist causes. One whispered memo accused him of wanting to dismantle centuries of order. But the truth was more complex and far more threatening. Leo didn't seek to destroy the Church. He sought to expose its hidden bruises, believing that only truth could heal what silence had protected for too long. And so, as the final votes were tallied and reality became inescapable, a strange stillness overtook the chapel. Even those who had opposed him lowered their eyes, not in reverence, but in resignation. A new kind of pope had been chosen, not the kind molded by Rome, but the kind forged in forgotten places. If you're starting to feel the tension rising, smash that like button, and let us know in the comments. Should a pope protect tradition or challenge it for something deeper? When Pope Leo XIV stepped into the light for the first time, he did not begin with tradition. He began with rupture. Standing under the floodlights of St. Peter's Basilica, his white garments billowing in the Roman breeze, he looked neither triumphant nor timid. He looked resolved. And then came the words, quiet, steady, and in English. Before I bless the world, I must ask it for forgiveness. The square, brimming with believers, gasped audibly. Cameras zoomed. Reporters scrambled. No one was ready. Leo spoke not as a victor, but as a man bearing wounds too long hidden. This institution has broken hearts. Silence cries, and closed its doors to the ones Christ opened his arms for. In that moment, the facade cracked. The grandeur of the Vatican stood still as the Pope refused to follow the script. There was no Latin blessing, no ceremonial gesture, just memory, sorrow, and confession. He named the unnameable, the survivors of abuse who were ignored for decades, the homeless who died outside locked churches, the women dismissed from ministry, the faithful who walked away not from God, but from the men who claimed to represent him. And he did not speak with anger, but with reverence. I do not come to condemn, he said. I come to remember. His voice didn't tremble, but some said his hands did. As he listed each forgotten soul, he wasn't reciting data. He was resurrecting stories. One by one, he spoke of names and faces, of letters unanswered, of wounds unopened. The world had tuned in for ritual. What it received was reckoning. It wasn't only the content of his speech. It was the fact that a pope had chosen vulnerability over authority, truth over tradition, humanity over hierarchy. And in doing so, he created something unprecedented, a silence that did not come from awe, but from awakening. In the square, the reactions were as divided as they were visceral. Some faithful dropped to their knees and wept. Others stared, bewildered, their lips tight with confusion. A group of seminarians from Kenya sobbed openly, holding each other. At the far end of the plaza, a few turned away, muttering that this was heresy disguised as humility. Inside media booths, print headlines were deleted mid-broadcast. The first pope of a new era, one journalist whispered. Or the last pope of the old one, another replied. But in the middle of it all, Leo simply stood there, unmoved by applause or backlash. He gave no closing benediction, only a soft, steady phrase, "Now let us listen." Then he turned and disappeared into the basilica. And just like that, centuries of ceremony were replaced by something more powerful, honesty. If this moment stirred something in you, leave your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and stay with us, because the storm was just beginning. In the hours after Leo's balcony confession, the Vatican turned into a hive of hushed frenzy. Doors slammed. Phones rang. Internal emails flew with subject lines marked urgent. The Curia, traditionally a body that moves with glacial patience, was suddenly racing to contain the shockwave. By midnight, press releases had been drafted and redrafted. One statement framed Leo's words as pastoral in tone. Another attempted to soften the moment as a reflection on human compassion. But the world had already heard the truth, and it wasn't coming from filtered memos. Videos of the Pope's speech, clipped and subtitled, were now viral across continents. In Manila, Churches stayed open all night as people sat in silence. In Sao Paulo, thousands marched with candles, not in protest, but in prayer. In New York, survivors of clerical abuse formed circles in public parks and simply wept. Leo hadn't asked them to come back, but he had acknowledged why they left. And that was enough to reopen wounds that had never really healed. Reactions within the church split like a fault line. In Berlin, reformist bishops praised Leo's honesty, calling it the spiritual reset we needed. In Lagos, priests quoted his words from the pulpit, drawing gasps from parishioners. But in Milan and Madrid, emergency councils were convened behind locked doors. Cardinal Massini, already a vocal critic of Leo's theology, called the speech a rupture too great to ignore. Rumors spread that several dioceses were considering withholding financial contributions to the Vatican until clarity was given. One bishop declared publicly that Leo's remarks could embolden those who wished to dismantle the sacred. Yet for all the institutional discomfort, something more powerful was happening outside the walls. Ordinary Catholics, those long dismissed, forgotten, or cast aside, were finding their voices. Social media overflowed with testimonies, some decades buried. "He named my pain," one woman wrote, "and I didn't realize until now how much I needed someone in Rome to see me." And Leo? He said nothing. For 2 days, the Pope who had shaken the pillars of tradition disappeared from the public eye. He canceled appearances, declined interviews. His spokesperson offered no updates. This silence was not defensive. It was deliberate. In a world addicted to instant reaction, Leo was doing something radical, letting the world feel. There were no corrections, no clarifications, no spin, just space. And in that space, conversations erupted in parishes, kitchens, offices, and schools. What does it mean for a pope to confess? Can you love an institution while admitting its flaws? Is it possible that healing begins not with an answer, but with an apology? If these questions resonate with you, subscribe now. Leave your reflection in the comments and stay with us, because the next step Leo took would change not just the Vatican, but the very definition of papal leadership. Behind closed doors in the Apostolic Palace, the atmosphere was electric, not with reverence, but with uncertainty. For centuries, papal authority had relied on predictability, Latin blessings, silent smiles, careful diplomacy. But Leo had shattered that rhythm. Now, the men who had worn crimson robes for decades were left facing a leader they could neither control nor predict. And it wasn't just his speech that had alarmed them. It was what he did next. In a move both symbolic and seismic, Leo refused to move into the lavish papal apartments. Instead, he remained in the modest guest wing of the Domus Sancti Marthi, where visiting clergy usually stayed. The marble floors of the palace echoed with the absence of their occupant. There were no new tapestries hung, no coat of arms raised over doorways. Leo was not interested in decor. He was interested in dismantling comfort. Power must be humbled, he reportedly told one aide, even in how it sleeps. But the true tremor came 3 days later, when each cardinal received a sealed envelope. Inside was not a decree, not a rebuke, but a request. Leo had invited all of them to a private gathering, not in the grandeur of the audience hall, but in the crypt beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where the tombs of past popes lay in silence. The message was simple: we will meet where the bones remember. And so, on a rainy morning, one by one, they descended. No thrones, no protocol, just chairs in a circle around the tomb of John XXI, the Pope who once tried to open the church's windows to the world. Leo did not lecture. He asked, "What do you fear most about truth?" he said. No one answered. And what would it take to listen not just to each other, but to those we refuse to hear? That day, for the first time in living memory, a pope asked his own hierarchy to confess, not sins, but silence. What followed was not reform, it was rupture. Leo proposed something unthinkable: shared leadership, not token consultation, real inclusion. He called for the integration of women into Vatican decision-making, not as advisors, but as equals. He suggested laity be given voting power in matters of pastoral priority. He insisted that bishops who had been exiled for speaking out be reinstated and heard. The reaction was visceral. Some cardinals turned pale. Others wept openly. One stormed out. Cardinal Massini, his voice shaking, said, "You risk unraveling what has held us together for centuries." But Leo remained calm. "Then perhaps," he said, "we were held together by fear, not faith." No press was present. No transcript was released. But within hours, whispers of meeting flooded into the wider church. And once again the world asked, was Leo reforming the church or building a new one entirely? If you believe in confronting the uncomfortable, hit that like button, share your thoughts, and stay tuned, because the questions are only beginning. While Vatican corridors murmur with anxiety, the true eruption began where Leo had always felt most at home, among the people. Across continents, faithful and fallen Catholics alike began to gather, not to protest, but to reflect. In Buenos Aires, thousands sat outside cathedrals with handwritten signs reading Gracias, Leo. In Manila, processions of children carried olive branches instead of rosaries. In Paris, priests replaced Sunday homilies with readings of Leo's speech, followed by open forums where parishioners, many of whom had never spoken in church, stood up to share their truths. And in Nairobi, a church once targeted for sheltering refugees painted a mural of Leo with the phrase, "Finally, a shepherd who hears us." It wasn't just the marginalized who responded. Young clergy, burned out by bureaucracy and ceremony, found new courage. Nuns long silenced in internal councils began hosting public discussions. Something sacred had been reawakened, and it didn't come from the altar. It came from the pews. But this uprising didn't look like rebellion. It looked like reclamation. In Dublin, abuse survivors organized prayer vigils in front of shuttered parishes, holding candles in silence. In Los Angeles, LGBTQ+ Catholics flooded a small parish that dared to broadcast Leo's words from the altar. "He didn't speak for us," one parishioner said through tears. "He spoke with us." These were not organized movements. There were no leaders, no manifestos, just pain turned to presence. In community centers, living rooms, and online forums, people began asking questions that had long felt too dangerous. What if holiness wasn't in hierarchy, but in honesty? What if authority wasn't granted by robes, but by courage? And what if the true reform of the church didn't begin in Rome, but in the hearts of those who never stopped believing, even after they stopped attending? Leo's words had opened a door, and millions were walking through. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Some dioceses issued official denouncements, branding Leo's approach theologically reckless and ecclesiastically irresponsible. In Texas, a bishop instructed his flock not to share the video, claiming it caused spiritual confusion. Wealthy donors threatened to pull funds. One Catholic newspaper published a scathing editorial titled, "The Pope Who Forgot His Place." But the backlash only deepened the divide and highlighted the very wound Leo had exposed. Because for every bishop who condemned him, there were hundreds of believers who finally felt seen. And for Leo, that was enough. He issued no counterstatement, no rebuttal. He didn't defend himself. He let the people do it for him, in their tears, in their anger, in their questions, and in their decision to return not to a perfect church, but to one finally brave enough to admit its flaws. If this chapter speaks to you, drop your story in the comments, like this video, and share it, because this is not just a story about the Pope. It's a story about us. No revolution survives without scars, and Leo's were beginning to show. The Vatican's financial offices reported an abrupt decline in private donations, particularly from influential dioceses and longtime benefactors. Several Catholic universities in the U.S. suspended partnerships with the Holy See, pending clarification. A global Catholic television network halted its Vatican coverage altogether. Internally, resistance hardened. Cardinal Massini organized a coalition of traditionalist leaders who began pressing for an extraordinary synod to address the doctrinal ambiguity and pastoral instability of the current pontificate. "The church must be shepherded, not shaken," read one official letter signed by 37 bishops across Europe and Latin America. The fear wasn't just about Leo's words. It was about what those words had unleashed. A church that once walked lockstep now found itself splintering into factions, those who clung to ritual and those who embraced reckoning. And at the center of that fault line stood Leo, silent, unflinching, and profoundly alone. But solitude did not mean surrender. Within the stone walls of his guest quarters, Leo continued to work. He convened small groups, not of cardinals, but of lay theologians, survivors of abuse, ex-priests, and young women discerning religious life. These gatherings, held without press or protocol, became laboratories for a new kind of church, one not ruled by fear of scandal, but by the courage to confront it. One evening, he wrote a letter by hand to a woman whose testimony had led to conviction of a prominent bishop. "You were the voice I needed to hear," he wrote. "Thank you for not giving up on God, even when his messengers failed you." Word of these private moments began to leak, not through press releases, but through testimony. Leo wasn't building a movement. He was creating memory, a living archive of those the church had forgotten, and whom he was determined never to forget again. Still, the institutional pressure mounted. A delegation of senior cardinals urged Leo to retract his public statements, or at least contextualize them for the sake of unity. "Unity built on denial," Leo replied, "is unity that breaks the moment truth arrives." He was asked to slow down, to wait, to let committees handle the reform. But Leo had heard that request before, and it had always ended in silence. What he knew now was that the cost of truth was steep, but the cost of silence was unbearable. "We do not lose the church by speaking," he said to one advisor. "We lose it when we stop listening." As rumors swirled of potential resignation, Leo gave no hint of stepping down. He didn't need to, because by now it was clear this papacy wasn't about a man in white. It was about the thousands of people around the world who had found in his voice the echo of their own. If you've ever paid a price for telling the truth, hit the like button, leave a comment, and share this message, because sometimes courage looks like standing alone. 1 year after the speech that shook the world, the Vatican announced a public address to mark the anniversary of Pope Leo XIV papacy. The announcement was brief, devoid of ceremony or promise, but the world was already watching. On the day of the address, the square filled, not just with clergy and faithful, but with skeptics, ex-believers, abuse survivors, and those who had once felt invisible beneath the towering walls of the church. There are no choirs, no red carpets, no banners, just anticipation. And when Leo finally emerged, dressed not in gold or brocade, but in plain linen, the crowd fell silent before he even spoke. This time, there were no surprises, no confessions, no speeches designed to shock. He simply said, "If I have failed you this year, I ask for grace. If I have seen you, I thank you. If I have changed anything, it was because you changed me first." And then he smiled, not like a pontiff, but like a man finally at peace. He spoke of letters from prisoners, of rosaries sent by the elderly, one bead at a time, of children's drawings taped to Vatican walls. He did not reference documents, doctrine, or politics. He spoke of presence, of human eyes meeting other human eyes. "I have met God," he said, in those who no longer believed he was watching. And then he paused, not for applause, not for effect, but because his voice cracked. For the first time, Leo looked overwhelmed. He steadied himself, raised his hand, not in blessing, but in reverence, and pointed to the crowd. "You are the church," he said, "not this building, not these robes. You." Around the square, people didn't cheer. They wept, some for grief, some for healing, some because, finally, someone had said aloud what they had whispered in their hearts for decades. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't restoration. It was something far more radical, recognition. And then came the gesture that would seal his legacy. Instead of retreating into the basilica, Leo descended the steps, alone. Vatican guards hesitated. Aides fumbled. But Leo walked calmly through the crowd, stopping before a child in a wheelchair. He knelt, kissed the boy's forehead, and whispered something only the child heard. Cameras flashed, but Leo never looked at them. His eyes were fixed on a human in front of him. And then, without another word, he disappeared into the people, not as pope, but as pilgrim. That night, as the basilica lights dimmed, someone hung a simple banner across the side entrance. It read, not a revolution, a remembrance. Around the world, stories of Leo's year continue to echo, not in headlines, but in hearts. If the story moved you, leave your truth in the comments, subscribe to this channel, and share this video. Because sometimes the loudest benediction is a whisper heard by those who thought no one was listening. What did Pope Leo XIV say that shocked the entire world? This fictional story takes you deep into the heart of the Vatican like never before. Through stunning revelations, hidden archives, and emotional testimonies, we explore the speech that changed everything, even for the most faithful. Watch until the end to uncover the silence, the rupture, and the unexpected courage that defined an entire era. Leave your thoughts in the comments, like the video, and subscribe for more powerful narratives. This video is a work of fiction. It is intended for storytelling and reflection purposes only.